everyone, and this is BioPhoenix here, and today we are taking a look at a Japan-only RPG that has not seen a fan translation, so you know what that means. Trying to put this together was quite the undertaking. So anyways, the game happens to be Marica Shinjitsu no Sekai, or also known as Marica the Real World, or the True World. So the game was released only on the Sega Saturn, and it was developed by Craft, and it was published by Victor, and it was released in 1997. And in case you don't know who the company Craft is, well, it's understandable because apparently they only made 2 games, and this was their last game. The first one they ever did was a game based after an anime series called Metal Fighter Miku, which I have seen before. So anyways, if you've been around my channel long enough, you would know that I've done a series called Games I Wish Got Fan Translated, and this was a game I featured in one of those episodes because I thought it looked really interesting. So what made me want to actually try and review this game the hard way? Well, there are 2 things that were really helpful, and one of those things was that someone on YouTube uploaded a full playthrough of the game where they added in English subtitles, and that happens to be English translator of retro games. They've only done 2 games so far, being this one and another Sega Saturn game called Virus. So I had to give a huge thank you to them. And the other thing I have to mention too is that someone on the archive managed to do a full scan of the official guidebook of the game. Out of all the obscure games that I've been taking a look at lately, I was not expecting to find a scan of this game. So without further ado, let's talk about the game's story, and boy is this a crazy one. So the game takes place in modern day Tokyo, and of course when I mean modern day I mean 1997, and it stars the main character, Marica Kenzaki. And she's your ordinary high school girl, so, you know, pretty typical stuff there. So one day she ends up doing some chores for her mother where she has to go out and get some groceries, and when she's on her way back, she notices that a weird-looking dog steals a piece of food off of her, and she follows it, and it winds up into an abandoned building where there's a creepy-looking guy at the bottom. So it turns out that the creepy-looking guy ends up being a terrorist who is actually trying to run away from the organization. So he gives her 2 things, being a floppy disk and an orb. But unfortunately for them, other members of the organization find them, they end up killing the one guy, and they try to kill her, but she ends up getting away from them. And it turns out that, thanks to the orb that she got, she ends up getting psychic powers such as psychokinesis, where she can manipulate objects. So she ends up beating the guys that chase after her, and when they die, they just turn into slime. So then there's a detective guy who is trying to figure out, like, what the hell's going on here. But of course, Marica herself doesn't want to reveal anything major about this because, you know, the situation is just way too weird and unbelievable. So now because she ended up killing a couple people within the terrorist organization and owns a secret data disk, she is now a big target of them. And in case you're wondering what the name of this terrorist organization is, they happen to be called FACT. Yeah, F-A-C-T. So yeah, that's the very basic of it, but of course, I do want to talk about many other things that are very important to mention, such as the other characters. So one of the other main characters that acquires in your party in this game happens to be Akira, and she's one of them badass punk rockers. So she happens to have a gang, and it turns out that her entire gang was slaughtered by the terrorist organization, so that's how she gets involved. And as for her psychic power, she's able to use teleportation. And as for the final member that goes into your party in this game, happens to be Kaname. She was raised in a rich family, and she happens to know Jujitsu. So how she gets involved is that her and her family do an outing, and it turns out that someone from the organization is trying to kidnap her, but the other 2 main characters end up saving her, and they find out that she is also a psychic. And the powers that she has happens to be telepathy, so she can read minds to those who come in contact with her. So once these 3 characters join together, that's when they go on the adventure of trying to figure out who FACT really is, and they're trying to take him down. So that's pretty much everything you need to know when it comes to basic stuff for the story, and yeah, obviously I'm not going to get into spoiler stuff, as, you know, it's a game that barely anyone played. And there's also a lot of other crazy characters too, but I'm not going to go over all of them because, you know, that would take too much time. But I suppose there is one character that I should mention who is a supporting character, and that happens to be Nobunaga, and no, not Nobunaga Oda, but the one from this game was supposedly supposed to be a psychic, but it turns out that he was only an entertainer on TV, so, you know, like an illusionist sort of thing. So once the main girls end up finding out that he's not really a psychic, of course, Akira just has to go, well, fuck this guy then. And I'm not really exaggerating that either, she actually does say the F word quite a bit throughout this game. So anyways, despite Nobunaga not being an actual psychic, he happens to get heavily involved with the main characters, so because of that, he ends up having to help them out. Now, before we move on to the other things, I do want to quickly mention too that so far from what I've explained of this game's story, you'd be thinking that this is some sort of happy-go-lucky adventure with a bunch of girls trying to stop a terrorist organization, but the thing that really surprised me was that not only is this game very mature for that it is rated 18+ over in Japan, but also, this game has quite a lot of dark content within it. Now, like I've been saying a bunch, I do not want to spoil any of this for anyone, because I do feel like that finding out about those moments during your first time playing is part of the fun about this game, and I don't want to ruin that for anyone else that potentially wants to try this game out. So for now, let's get moving on and start talking about the gameplay. So it is very similar to a lot of other RPGs around this time, where it's top-down view, you run around town, you go out and buy items and upgrades. And I did translate the menu screen in this game, and this is what came up, so if you do want to play this game, then make sure to screen cap this. And I don't really need to go over all this, given that it is pretty self-explanatory, but I will talk about two of them, that being Think and Move. So what Think does is that it pretty much tells you exactly what your next objective is, and even using Google Translate on your phone actually translated these helpful hints really damn well. So even if there were no guides available for this game, you could probably get through it with this alone. And what Move does is that allows you to fast travel between different areas within the game, but you can only use it when the character Akira is in the party because, you know, she's the only one that used teleportation. So the fact that this game does have these two features is quite nice. And when it comes to dungeon exploration, there is no random encounters in this game, and I found that it made playing through the game smooth to go through. Although sometimes trying to get around the enemies can be a little tricky, especially ones that are around a tight corner, but the fact that you can see the enemies and you can kind of take your time with them, that's the thing that I do like. And when it comes to the game's combat, it is indeed a turn-based RPG. So first, let's go over the commands. You got attack, superpower, tool, defense, and escape. So nothing complicated here, everything's easy to understand. But this is one of those turn-based RPGs where you have to directly command every character in your party first and select your target, and then everything just kind of plays out. But one really good improvement that this game does do in this style is that, let's say you have all three of your characters target the same enemy, and that enemy ends up dying before all of them get their turn. Well, the good thing is that all your party members will then end up targeting the next enemy beside that one, so therefore it doesn't waste a turn, because there are some RPGs where you do that, and then it turns out, oh no, you hit the error. So that's something that I was really glad about. And another thing I should mention about the combat is that for these special attacks that you can actually combine them together if you make the right ones. It works similar to games like Persona 2. I know that was one game I can think of out of the top of my head where you have fusion spells that you combine them together to make a powerful one. So yeah, I thought it was pretty neat that this game has that. But yeah, outside of that though, it is your typical turn-based RPG with no crazy gimmicks. So now, let's get moving on and start talking about the other things, like the graphics. And the graphics in this game, I really like them a lot. So everything is 2D and has a very nice 90s anime style, which of course I'm a huge fan of. There's a lot of really nice bright colors in the game, and there's some pretty cool details in the background of certain areas, such as this one store having a Sailor Moon looking character up front. And while yes, this game does have a lot of gray in the background, I do feel like it does look nice with the game and it does suit with everything. But probably the best part of the graphics happens to be the character designs and the way the battles look. So as you may have seen with the battles, they are in a first-person sort of view, and there's huge sprites. And every single character has their own idle pose, the way how they get damaged, the way how they attack. They all look really cool looking. Now, for those of you that might have remembered that I reviewed a game on the PSP called Arms Heart. It was also a turn-based RPG that had the first-person view, kinda like this, but the one thing I complained about that game was that I said that they looked cheap-looking and that it was just not very exciting to look at, where this, however, I think is the exact opposite, where it's really cool-looking, and it is pretty exciting to see all the different ways that they drew all these characters doing different attacks and getting hit and whatnot. It also reminds me of another Sega Saturn game I've seen many times before called Far East of Eden, The Fourth Apocalypse. But the one thing that that game does do better than this one though, is that all those big sprites that the battle system that game has some really awesome animation going on. This one unfortunately doesn't use a lot of animation for it, but despite that, it's still a very cool looking battle system. And as for the character designs, man, they went really all out on this one. So the three main characters I all think do look pretty good, even though I do find that Marica does look very similar to Hikaru from Match Night Rayearth, but I mean, hey, that's not a bad comparison. But it's really the monster designs is where shit gets crazy. For some examples is that you got a crazy wizard guy, you got a Kappa with a clock on his back, you got these twin female characters that happen to wear giant mecha suits, it's all sorts of nutty stuff. But there are two enemies in particular that I do want to touch on a little more. So see these enemies right here, they look like generals if they were like wrapped up like mummies. If you're very familiar with some certain fucked up anime out there, don't you think they look kinda familiar in a disturbing way? Yeah, I won't get too much into detail about that, but if you know, you know. And as for the last one I want to touch on here, I'm not going to go too much into detail about this one because it is kind of spoiler related, and I probably won't show it on screen because firstly, I'd have to censor it and I really don't feel like doing that, and secondly, I really do feel like that it's one of those things that's really going to take you by surprise once you do see it in game. So there's an enemy in this game that has a dude's head with a female body that's all stitched together, and they are completely naked. The first time I saw it, I was just like, what the heck? So yeah, that's pretty damn shocking for a game like this, and yeah, I know the game is rated 18+, but I really didn't think they were gonna go that far with it. So yeah, with knowing all this, there is a lot of crazy looking enemies in this game, and I'm all for it. I actually love that shit. So yes, overall, the graphics in this game are pretty great. And as for the game's music, I also think it's a really good OST, but I will admit and say that I do find it to be kind of hard to describe. Like, the best way I can describe it is that it's kind of like a mixture between Shin Megami Tensei and the very first Sakura Wars game on the Saturn, and even then I don't even know if that's like the best way of summing it up. But yes, you got quite a few tracks that do sound very mysterious-like and do kind of fit the whole modern setting of the game. But then you kind of got some more upbeat tracks that also do sound kind of epic at the same time, like you're about to get some good shit done. And those are the tracks that do kind of remind me of the Sakura Wars music a little. And then you have some decent variety of other ones that are very emotional sounding, and some that are a bit more on the peaceful side. And some of them are pretty catchy too, and I like them quite a bit. So yeah, I do like this OST quite a bit. I wouldn't say it's like the most amazing shit you'll ever hear, but I do think it has more than enough good tracks to stand out. And now, as for the game's voice acting, obviously it's all in Japanese, but I do think it is interesting that this is one of those games that in the cutscenes there's no dialogue text, it's just all voices. So meaning that if someone wanted to do a fan translation for this game, they'd have to program subtitles into the game, or they'd have to replace the Japanese voice acting with English ones. But yes, as you can see here with this big list of voice actors in here, I have to say, it's quite a stacked cast. Now obviously I won't be able to cover every single person in here because we'd be here forever, but there is a lot of notable voice acting here that you probably have heard in many animes and video games. Such as Marica is being voiced by the same one that does the voice of Chun-Li and Asuka from Evangelion. And Akira is being voiced by the same person that does Tina Armstrong from Dead or Alive and Kunoichi from the Samurai Warrior games. And Kaname is being voiced by the one that does Klonoa's voice, oddly enough. And then the last two that I want to mention is that there's a guy that's voiced by the same one that does Phoenix Icky from Saint Seiya. And finally, the legend himself, the man that has played Jigen from Lupin the Third throughout his whole career, is in this game too. So yeah, even with just that alone, that's still a pretty damn impressive cast for such a random ass game like this. Now, if you wanted to go out and buy yourself a copy of this game, well, it's not cheap. Though, not like I'm surprised, but at the same time though, I always felt like a lot of the text-based stuff on the Sega Saturn are not nearly as expensive as, let's say, like the shoot-em-ups or the action platformers. And obviously I'm talking about the Japan-only ones, cause, you know, for North America, yeah, you can forget that shit. But yes, most of the copies that I'm seeing are about $200, though I did see one that's selling for $80, but I'm not really sure why. But either way, you get the point, it's not a cheap game. So now, as for my overall thoughts on this game, this is a game that I actually did kinda like. I actually thought it was a pretty decent game for the time it came out. So let's go over everything that I liked and didn't like. So I'm not going to go over the things that I already talked about, but I will just say that I do think that the story in this game is actually really good, and I would say it probably is one of the best parts about this game, because as soon as I was getting into it, like, I was hooked. Not only do I like the crazy weirdness that the game has, but also some of the game's darker themes I actually thought were done pretty well. For an example, and of course I won't go into spoilers, but the character Akira is not only my favorite character in this game, but she also had a pretty tragic backstory that I thought was really interesting. And Konami I thought was a pretty interesting character too, and one thing that surprised me about her was that because I said that she was like, you know, the rich noble type, you would think she'd be like this snobby bitch that's always rude to everyone, but nah, she was pretty cool about most things, and I also liked the fact that she wasn't afraid to fight head on. Also, another good thing I have to say too is that there is barely any puzzles within this game. The closest thing to a puzzle that this game has is that later on in the game, there's a part where you gotta find an object and then bring it back to a certain area. That's literally it. Also, most of the dungeons in this game are not confusing and maze-like, so most of them are pretty straightforward, and I'm perfectly okay with that. In fact, I'd say the overall game is very easygoing when it comes to the difficulty. I'd say the hardest part about the game is really just the beginning part, just because your characters don't have a lot of HP and MP, and you don't get a lot of money to buy items. But as you get farther, it does get easier. Now, for someone like me who is trying to play this game to review and talk about it, yeah, of course I'm going to be really happy about playing a game that's not hard, but at the same time though, if this game was in English, yeah, I'd still be okay with it, because, you know, I don't think every single RPG needs to be balls to the wall hard. So knowing that, if you are expecting this game to be challenging, then just be mindful that you're probably going to be very disappointed. But another thing that also goes inside with this is the fact that this game is also not that long of a game. It probably took me about 20-something hours. I don't remember the exact time, but I know for a fact it was not more than 30. So I did found it to be a nice length for a chill RPG, because, you know, I don't think every single game needs to be 60 hours plus to be good. But now, let's get moving on to the not-so-good things. So firstly I have to mention is that the main character, Marica, I find her to be a bit on the generic side. That's not to say I think she sucks and I hate her, cause no, I didn't think that at all. I thought she was okay, but compared to the other two characters, I didn't think she was nearly as interesting. Like, yes, she does go through a lot of bad shit, and you do feel bad for her, of course. But to me, she always just comes across as, you know, the typical goody little two-shoes high school girl, which I've seen a million times in anime. And while there are some certain twists with her that are somewhat interesting, but as again, I just don't think they're nearly as interesting as what the other two characters provided. And one thing about the exploration that I haven't mentioned yet is that whenever you're running around a city and are trying to cross the road, yeah, you actually have to wait for the traffic light to change, just like real life. Now at first I was like, oh, that's kinda interesting and neat, but as you get farther through the game, yeah, it does get a little bit tedious after a while. Not like the wait time is super long, but still, it's just one of those things that, after a while, I could have done without it. I mean, come on, I get that this game was trying to be realistic with something, but come on, the game has a freaking werewolf using machine guns. After seeing that shit, do we really expect realism out of it? Fuck no. And as for the last thing that I have to mention here, and this is probably the worst aspect, is that the battles in this game can be a little bit on the slower side, which is unfortunate. Yeah, with all the good things I've said about it, with how simple and easy it is, and it's not complicated, and how cool it looks, unfortunately, trying to get through the dialogue text after making an attack or after getting damaged, yeah, there's no way to fast forward through that. And there's many parts throughout the game where you gotta fight like a ton of enemies at once, and those parts, yeah, they can feel like a little bit of a drag. But if you do manage to get some skills that can hit multiple enemies at once, then it's not so bad, but it's still a little bit on the slower side. So that's the one thing about this game that does make it a little bit dated, but I don't think it's too rough to go back to, because I've played many other games that came out around this time that are also turn-based but feel way slower than this. But I know for sure that anyone that is more used to the more modern RPGs will probably not be a fan of that aspect, and I don't blame them. I mean, hey, I agree. But despite these couple things that I mentioned though, I still liked this game and found it to be a very interesting experience. Like I said, this one is more about the story than it is the gameplay, but the gameplay itself is not bad by any means. And I can say for sure now that yes, this would be one that I definitely can't wait to see get a fan translation one day. So I guess that makes up for the last game that I reviewed before this, where that game unfortunately did not turn out to be great, where this one is actually pretty good. Now, because this game came out in 1997 and it is an RPG, I guess you would expect that most people were probably too busy playing Final Fantasy VII than playing many other RPGs that came out around the time, so yeah, I think because of that, it probably didn't sell very well and is now considered as a rare game. But one interesting thing I did find out about was that the creator of this game said that he originally wanted to make a sequel to this game, but because it didn't do very well, unfortunately the sequel never happened. But apparently he did write a book about some of the concepts that were going to be for the sequel to it, but it's kind of tough to find online, and I would imagine it's probably not in English either. But I think it would have been cool if this game did get a sequel, but given how much time has passed since then, yeah, probably isn't gonna happen. But yes, with that being said, yeah, I like this one, and would I recommend it? It's always hard to recommend a game like this with no fan translation at the moment, but if it does have one, then yeah, I'd say it's definitely worth a try for sure. For that, this game still has a lot of charm to it that does make it interesting, and even with some of the complaints I did have about the game, it was not unbearable to get through, and for me personally, I would rather play a shorter RPG that has a couple slow moments than a longer one where it's very much a chore to play through. So that being said, thanks for watching and commenting, and have yourselves a great day.
In America.